All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the fourth and final session of the 2021 virtual Conservation Finance Bootcamp. I'm Leigh Whelpton with the Conservation Finance Network, and on behalf of my colleagues and our partners at Highstead and the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, thank you for joining us today, for sticking with us this week, for all of your contributions to the chat box so far. A few quick housekeeping notes, as usual. This session is being recorded. We're going to make all 4 webinar recordings available on our website as a later date. Feel free to look back over, share with colleagues, all that good stuff. As you know, we're going to keep you on mute throughout the presentation, but we do ask for you to type your questions into the chat box. We'll have time for the panel discussion and Q&A here to get to those, and we've got some help monitoring the chat box for your questions and submissions as well. We also invite you to engage and share any ahas or takeaways that you find significant on the social media platform of your choosing. We're using the hashtag CFN Bootcamp, and we'll put that in the chat box promptly. Lastly, if you've been with us this week, you know the drill. We're trying to have as much interaction as possible, getting to know who's attending, where you're coming from. So we do ask for you to help us kick off that habit by sharing your name, organization, and your location in the chat box. So alongside asking you to put name, organization, affiliation, we also have a chat prompt to kick off today's session, best practices in project development. And so maybe just lean back in your chair a little bit, think about some of the past project work you've been involved with, or perhaps your organization has pursued, and just spend a minute thinking of a project or perhaps a project proposal that had some critical flaws. What was maybe the central or most key flaw in your mind? If you're brave enough, we'll ask you to share that in the chat box, and we'll consider that a very interactive component of this session today. So as we get going here, do put into the chat box, for those of you brave enough, what a key flaw was in a project or project proposal that you've been involved with or aware of to date. If we think back across the week, so far we've covered a few case studies in innovation, and that's covered carbon offset project in Oregon. That's covered environmental impact bonds. We've gotten into a dairy operation acquisition and green water infrastructure in the California Delta. Today, we're going to be talking about commonalities, whether in best practice for project development or some patterns that have helped us understand when things don't go to plan. For the panel today, I'm joined by April Mendez, co-founder and CEO of Greenprint Partners, formerly Fresh Coast Capital, Sean Penrith, CEO of Gordian Knot Strategies, and Chris Wilson, Director of Conservation Ranching Initiatives at the National Audubon Society. I also want to just take a minute and have a special shout out. We're very lucky today. We have Peter Stein of Lime Timber and Brad Gentry from the Yale School of Environment, both co-founders of the bootcamp, and then a few years after they had launched the bootcamp, co-founders of CFN, the national network, international network, if you will, that emerged from the bootcamp back in 2012. We have also asked for Brad and Peter's help editorializing and commenting on today's session. So don't be surprised if they join us at some point in the discussion today. So as told, we're here to talk about and unpack commonalities. What do successful conservation projects have in common? What are the common pitfalls in project development and project management? We were lucky enough to review 25 projects funded by the Department of Agriculture's Conservation Innovation Grant Program here in the US, and developed a practical blueprint, the ARCH framework, for designing conservation projects, conducting diligence on investments and funding proposals, and mitigating risks more effectively. So this session is really meant to provide an overview of that framework, to dig deep on where we got and how we came to some of that intelligence on project structure and development, and really think about what intelligence that gives us to better mitigate project risks or those things that we are funding and financing. I'm going to start with just some very broad table setting before handing things over to Sean. I assume everyone's familiar with some of the framing spiel, but we are very much undercapitalized in conservation by the better part of $1 billion globally and annually. At the same time, private investment and other payers are increasingly recognizing the opportunity to enter into conservation projects and markets. We know that project innovation is on the rise, but it's very difficult to understand how something was structured, much less how to apply that insight to other efforts. And I'll share a little context there. When we were doing the research phase of the Arch Framework report, looking across the cohort of conservation innovation grants, we had to do a lot of trust brokering to help people understand that we weren't going to throw them under the bus with knowledge of some friction or challenges that they had encountered in the course of their project implementations. It's easy enough for people to talk about where their project or organization succeeded, but there's just such rich learnings that come from unpacking failure or perhaps a little more empathetically worded when projects had to navigate pivot or when ultimately they didn't quite go to plan. And from our perspective, and I think from the perspective of the panel today, certainly from kind of the broader network of innovative project attempts, we need to get a little bit more comfortable with failure. It's part and parcel to innovation, but it really has been nearly impossible to learn from. And as we know, it can very much be penalized by funders who are accustomed to the success rate of more conventional conservation grant activity. So where does that put us? Well, hey, we really need to learn the effective elements of project design if we're ever going to get anywhere close to scaling past pilot efforts and getting towards functional, scaled, effective environmental market activity, conservation-oriented impact investment approaches, really rewarding public-private partnerships and joint ventures, all that. And so the Arch framework, it's got some great intelligence from the data set of conservation innovation grants and those elements that we can learn from to guide our efforts going forward. So with that, Sean, I hope I didn't steal too much of your thunder, but we'll pass things over to you to actually introduce the Arch.
Yep, thank you so much. And I was just looking at the chats, they're coming in, they're actually quite perfect in terms of buy-in from critical partners, fundraising, and not uncovering the ways to create value. So keep them coming, that's really important. Let me share the deck. One second. Let's see. Is that coming through? Yeah. Okay.
Yep, you're good, Sean.
All right, good. So thanks very much. I'm going to try and keep this brief so that we have some time for dialogue, and also we can iterate on these key flaws that you're identifying. So let me get cracking here. So the key thesis that we're approaching, Leigh did a good job at explaining the context. What's really important to us as we worked with Leigh on this project is the realization that you've all no doubt uncovered yourselves, which is impact funding is precious. Everyone's after it. I get calls all day long about who do we go to get philanthropic capital? Who in the world will give us impact capital, and so on. And so as a result, you have a lot of the funders inundated with proposals that unfortunately are lacking. And so because these funders and project proponents don't necessarily have a guiding framework, it's difficult for evaluation. And so unfortunately, you end up with some projects that shouldn't be funded that are stealing precious oxygen from others. Was that a question?
No, just a line we muted. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So that's the vantage point. Disclosures, I won't read through it. We participated in SIGs and we took the appropriate actions to ensure that there wasn't a conflict. Me, Daniel, and Leigh. Just quickly to frame up the approach we took, as Leigh said, we compared 25 SIG projects. We recognized that the cohort's small, but the diversity of the projects was very revealing. We examined the monitoring and their final report submissions to NRCS, and then we conducted rounds of structured interviews where we shared the findings back with the SIG proponents. We also conducted a survey. The management committee also weighed in on that survey, and all proponents had a chance to review the draft findings. And we didn't start out with the arch, to be clear. We were looking for patterns, and we weren't sure what the patterns were as we started going through this process, but they emerged very clearly and resoundingly. Very quickly on the tangible findings, we found that of those 25 we reviewed, 64% of them did indeed achieve on-ground conservation. 32% of them deployed private capital, and 68% of them have led to follow-on projects. So there's a lot of success in there. But as Leigh mentioned, there's a lot of failure, a lot of barriers, a lot of obstacles, and we encountered that. And people were very candid with us, which was great. You'll notice if you've read the report, we highlight the successes and point out the success to individual proponents, but the failures and the shortfalls, we don't accredit to anyone. We just describe how to mitigate them. One thing that's really important, we found, is to understand the payer spectrum. And so what we mean here is ultimately who is paying ultimately for the intervention, the ecosystem service outcome, the product, whatever it is that the project proposal you're assembling is purporting to sell or commoditize or add value to. And we broke those into groups, being consumer grants all the way through to corporate offsets. And I won't go through them, other than to say it's incredibly important because it informs one of the vital components of the ARCH framework, which I'll share with you in a second, which is who is the payer? And what was interesting about this is that there were some projects that were very clear about who the payer was, and some projects had incredible design intent and scientific background, but couldn't really identify who's going to pay for the intervention at the end. And no surprise, those projects struggled. So, and again, I invite you to read the report if you haven't, because we go into these payer categories, but you'll see the link between payer and the ARCH framework. So this is the ARCH framework, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through it because it's informative and important as to how we assembled it and its utility. So if you think of an arch, and we ended up with a structure just because it had durability, longevity, and we have found that the patterns that emerged ended up being these 7 elements, and they sort of aligned with the structure of an arch. And the way you assemble an arch is you start with your 2 springers. You put down your 2 springer rocks, or your pavers, or however you want to call them. And the one on the left here, springer 1, is the problem, and the one on the right is the pair. If you don't have 2 springers in place, it's very difficult to build an arch that has durability. You have to start there. And I'll talk about the problem, which again seems intuitively obvious to many of you on this call, but there were elegant solutions that were crafted with high academic and intellectual firepower behind it. These solutions were looking for a problem to solve, as opposed to identifying a problem and developing the solution. And so inherently, that was a challenge. And on the other side is this other springer, which I mentioned earlier, is identifying the ultimate payer. Who is going to pay, whether it's a corporation or a consumer or an agency, and being very clear. Now, some projects were very good at identifying the payer, but it was a hypothetical payer. And so we have put special emphasis in the report that you have to identify and verify that you have a willing and able payer that is aligned or teed up for the project. Many projects did not have this. Some projects did a fabulous job at it. And those were the projects that ultimately led to impact on the ground and were able to rally with subsequent project follow-up after the SIG ended. The other key element of the arch is what we call a keystone, which is the one that holds the arch up. And we identified this important keystone element as the partners. And you'll hear in a minute, hopefully, from my fellow panel members, just how important it is to recognize the strength of your role and your competency and where you actually need help. So in Audubon's case, which you'll probably hear about, just understanding that supply chain complexities are perhaps not a core competency of an organization, and then bringing in that expertise is really important. There were some projects we found where the solution was squarely landing on a problem that had been identified or a need. The proponents were incredibly skilled at, edge of field monitoring and drainage issues around nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, and then had this paragraph that said, we'll go out and raise impact investment. But they really didn't have anyone on the team that was able or familiar to speak in the vernacular and parlance of an impact investment world where that became a reality. And many of those admittedly admitted that they thought capital would just flow in. And so having those partners is incredibly important. So those are the three central elements of an arch. If you don't have either one of those in place, there is no arch. The other elements we've identified as the four voussoirs. We're hoping to bring the word voussoir into mainstream vocabulary in this country in conservation finance. But the first one I'll talk about is practices. So as you think about, and many of you I see from the attendee list are involved in different projects, there is a potential weakness of designing a project or proposing a project that calls on practices yet to be developed or yet to be proven. And the challenge with that is many of these projects struggled during the funding cycle to both develop and prove these practices and implement them in a pilot phase and then take them to scale. And so our recommendation is not to say that you shouldn't break ground by innovative practices, but if you want to achieve impact and rally investment or funding around your project, clearly articulating what practices you're going to use and why they have been used effectively elsewhere and are ready to go is very important. The next one is co-creation, which you'll hear about from the Greenprint partner, because they did a fabulous job. But the idea here is, and again, I'll take it from the weakness point of view, fabulously designed, elegant, articulate, rational proposals designed by somebody, in DC for a constituency in a rural area on the West Coast. And the problem was that the solution was inherently strong. The approach was inherently strong. The only problem was that their proposal proposed that they would fly in to this rural area and tell the constituents there, we have the solution, please sit down with us. And they suffered real challenges, not backlash so much, but certainly not the uptake that they were expecting. Sorry, I have two young boys in the background that are attempting to annihilate each other, so apologies for that. But this notion of co-creation is incredibly important, which is designing the solution hand in hand with your target community, constituency, landowner type, or so on. And if you fail to do that, and here's the important part, and you'll see we reinforce this in the report, it has to be done sincerely. It has to be done empathetically. It has to be done consistently. The other voussoir is data and measurement. If you cannot articulate the impact that you're having and how you're going to go about measuring that impact and deploying measurement systems to ensure that the ecosystem service uplift that you're proposing is in fact there, it's going to be very difficult for you to go and find a second round of capital because you can't articulate it. So that one is pretty self-evident. Some people did a great job of it, and some people just kind of missed the boat entirely. The other one is policy and alignment. Again, great projects, great design. It came time to implementation and found that they were out of sync with the current legal framework or with a policy direction that was going. And so what we're saying here is that as you consider designing a project or submitting a proposal for investment or funding, is that you have a very clear-eyed view about tailwinds and headwinds as it relates to policy and legal alignment there. So those are the essential elements. We found incredible value, which we turned into best practice bricks, which are 1 through 10. These are, the way we frame it is the arch is for design, and then the best practice bricks are for project implementation phase. So you want to make sure that as you implement, you've got, for example, brick 6, which is risk mitigation, very important. Some of you have no doubt encountered this. You got the cart before the horse problem. Nobody wants to blink first. And so you have to figure out, how do you create the risk mitigation to allow that anchor partner, anchor buyer, anchor stakeholder to participate where you've reduced the risk. Really, really important. Number 8 is really important. Being agile enough to test, learn, and iterate based on where you, the learnings that you encounter, incredibly important. Some projects found that while they posited they need climate finance or conservation finance, in fact, found that they didn't need it. And if that's the case under Brick 5, then you need to pivot very quickly. 10, one very succinct word there, simplify. Some of the projects were just so complex to understand, too many moving pieces, that the chances for the project to fail were just very, very high. So hopefully that gives you a sense of, designing the project using the arch. And again, the arch is designed or has utility for investors and funders, because we're proposing that this could be used as a screening criteria. If you've got 2 projects that you're looking at and you say, are the essential arch elements there? To what extent are they speaking to the best practice bricks? You can now evaluate, sort of like a FICO score or the way the venture capitalists review venture investments. There's a certain framework that they need to see, and could this be the framework for climate friendly investment? And so those are the elements. I'm going to just move through. I've got a few more slides just really emphasizing the application of the arch. So let me move there quickly. So again, coming back to this original thesis that funding and impact investment and philanthropy is scarce and there's high competition. Many times this capital is sitting on the sidelines because it's not seeing the investable product that's out there. We need to create something that allows the appropriate due diligence and comparison from one project to another, so that the capital is moving a lot faster to the $400 billion a year that we actually need. So that the diligence and the design, incredibly important. We do see value in the arch being improved over time. Again, the cohort of 25 is low. We'd love to validate that with others and a larger cohort. And so we're proposing and recommending that practitioners and funders integrate the arch framework in their design and their consideration. This is just a quick example. You'll hear from the other panel members, but Xerxes really had the practices ready to go. It really made the difference in terms of their project being able to hit the ground running. And so in summary, again, start with your springers, needs and pairs, put the voussoirs in place as rapidly as possible, and pay attention to your keystone. Same thing with the investors I've talked about. Use it as a screening tool. And the report, if you haven't accessed it, it's on the GordianNotStrategies.com website. Feel free to download it, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. And a handy shorthand analogy that we were using in the development of the arch is, think about each of the arch elements is effectively a slide in the pitch deck. We know that in the clean energy venture capital world, there's a very tried and true pitch deck that the proponents or the funders and investors use to vet each other. But in the conservation and the conservation finance space, we really didn't have the pitch deck outline. So in some ways, we invite you to think about the arch as really elements of the pitch deck to make sure that you don't have a really critical gap that would foretell some issues down the road. So thank you, Sean. Way more to talk about and unpack than we have time for, but let's pivot to the actual project proponents. So we've invited 2 of the project proponent, what what am I trying to say? The case studies that we used as part of the cohort of 25 NRCS Conservation Innovation Grants, especially those that we consider to be particularly good examples of some of the springers and voussoirs. So I believe we have April Mendez queued up to speak next. April, you want to join us and take it away?
Happy to. Thanks so much for having me and for doing all of this awesome work. I'm listening to Sean and Leigh go over the ARCH framework, and I'm thinking, now this finally makes sense of all of the things that we tried to do. We landed on intuitively, I think, but having the framework really provides a lot of great clarity and kind of solidity of future planning efforts around similar types of conservation work. So really excited about the work that you all have done here. For everyone listening, I'm April Mendez, CEO of Greenprint Partners. We are a green stormwater infrastructure company that has a mission. We come with a point of view about what good conservation looks like in the stormwater space, and that mission is to get the most good out of green stormwater infrastructure. And if we can go to the next slide. I'm going to focus today on the case study that was in the report, which is on the Well Farm in Peoria, Illinois, which is a green stormwater infrastructure project that also became a working community farm that created an urban agriculture apprenticeship program and some other really cool community benefits. But I will let the a video that we've got go ahead and introduce that for us. If we could go to the next slide, and then Helen, go ahead and cue the video. And then I'll unpack it after the video vis-a-vis the ARCH framework.
My name is Margarita Williams. I live in Peoria, Illinois. For me, living here, I had some good experience and bad experience. It's all in what you make it. Gardening is good for a lot of things. Gardening is a therapy, you know. When you're going through a situation, you can come over here and have a peace of mind, growing, you know, just taking your mind off of certain things. It's like a healing process. When I look out my window and I look at this garden and just see how amazing it have taken off, I'm just like, wow, I was a part of that. I think it's a good project for this community.
Peoria has been an amazing partner to us. They're a really forward-thinking city in terms of what their bigger goals are for what it means to be a sustainable, modern city that's addressing its stormwater problems head-on.
In Peoria, we have combined sewers. Those are an outdated practice.
There's over 770 cities across the United States that are dealing with combined sewers. During heavy rain events or snow melt, diluted sewage flows into fresh waterways.
We need to manage stormwater. You could build gray infrastructure, which means you build bigger pipes or tunnels, or you could use green infrastructure, which is a way of mimicking the natural water cycle or soaking that into the ground.
When rain falls on concrete, it runs off our sidewalks, our streets, into our sewer systems, where it can create combined sewer overflows and bring water pollution into our waterways. Green infrastructure actually absorbs water right where it falls, so it never needs to run off into those sewer systems in the first place. The Well Farm is a really exciting demonstration project that can prove how a community can really come together to collectively design and build their own green infrastructure. We collaborate with the community to identify their top priorities. This neighborhood is a food desert, and it was really important to have a space where food could be produced that could really engage the community. That's where this idea of a stormwater farm to bring together stormwater solutions with urban agriculture came to be. This property is able to manage 1.3 million gallons of stormwater a year, alongside a training ground for urban agriculture apprentices to learn how to grow and market food in the local community.
As a community, as a city, we came together around this idea that we could do this with 100% green infrastructure and it would benefit everyone. The Well Farm is one of those pilot projects to test what we can do using green infrastructure and exploring that to see what success we can have and how we can expand that success throughout the combined sewer area and beyond.
I never had an opportunity to actually see myself participate and then look at the outcome is growing. you know, it has bloomed, and we all did it as a community. Here the light is right here behind you. It shows that Peoria can do good things here in the community.
Great, thanks for that, Helen. So you all saw what we ended up coming up with through a very collaborative process, which I will enumerate in just a second, was a green stormwater specific project aimed at helping the city of Peoria solve their green stormwater and their combined sewer overflow challenge. And it was a solution that brought together multiple stakeholders across the city and the community to design this solution. So we could go to the next slide. I'll break it down just a bit in terms of the ARCH. So the ARCH recommends first that you've got clarity on the problem that you aim to solve. The city of Peoria already had very strong clarity on the problem that they needed to solve, and it was a clarity with a regulatory driver behind it. That's the combined sewer overflow challenge. And then we went to identifying payers. We knew that for the future, the city of Peoria was going to be obligated to pay for this solution, but they didn't have a signed consent decree at the time. And so there wasn't political will to start to invest in a significant way yet in green stormwater infrastructure, because they were waiting for the regulatory driver to really start to take place. And so we came alongside them to say, you know, let's think about ways that we could potentially fund some early implementation and experimentation projects that will help you all get a better sense of how you could address this problem with a green stormwater infrastructure solution, but potentially with a whole host of additional co-benefits, so that we can start to elevate the profile of the potential power of what a green infrastructure could be if it's thought about in a non-traditional way. And so we eventually arrived at the USDA as another and the most immediate payer. But before we get to that, I'll go to the next slide, because getting to that decision, it required the co-creation component. So in terms of the developed stages here, number one, the use of effective and implementable practices. There's at least a decade's worth of work now around green stormwater infrastructure, demonstrating its capabilities in terms of combined sewer overflow. Though there's still lots of questions out there and lots of performance monitoring, et cetera, that's happening and that needs to continue to happen. It's a relatively well-received technology. The co-creation started with first conversations with the city public works department about their combined sewer overflow challenges and their commitment to a 100% green approach to trying to solve that sewer overflow. Then we also engaged the chief innovation officer, Anthony Corso, who you saw in the video. So Jane Gerdes was representing the public works department, Anthony Corso representing the innovation office. And through Anthony's help, we started to think more broadly about the multi-benefit opportunities and where we might want to focus on a single benefit or a collection of benefits. And we were able then to bring in the economic development department and the community, the public health, the county health department, and then start to identify community-based organizations in this particular zip code where the combined sewer overflow challenges were the greatest. So that we enumerated then who are the community-based organizations that are real assets in this community. Let's go talk to them and find out what challenges they're facing and what priorities they would like to see potentially addressed through the design of this program. Through that, we got to information about this particular zip code is a food desert. There's a need for apprenticeship training, and there's a couple of nonprofit organizations that are already involved in this space, and they could come on board as partners to shape up this project. That got us to a place where we could identify an agricultural component being a key part of this, and the USDA being a primary funding source for it. So all of that happened before we got to defining who the primary payer was going to be. And then once we had the funding, that then kicked off a robust co-creation that expanded the duration of the entire project. We formed a stakeholder advisory working group that included all of the folks that I had talked about previously from the various city agencies, the community-based organizations, and the urban agriculture nonprofit that became a primary paid partner as part of the entire project, and then added in hyper-local residents. We said, you know, we're doing this as a place-based project, and it's going to mostly and first and foremost impact the residents who live around this area. So we started mapping exactly who is in that location, and going out and doing door knocking and going to community meetings and saying, hey, we've got this concept that we're working on. Would you be interested in being a part of it? We'd love to invite you to be a part of the stakeholder working group. And that's how we met Margarita, who you also saw profiled in the video. That working group then met every 2 months over the course of 3 years to design and manage the implementation of the program. Third, aligning with the legal policy and regulatory conditions. This was clearly aligned with the requirements for managing combined sewer overflows. We also, with the USDA funding, needed to add it in grant requirements around the food production component, and local health requirements that governed how we made decisions about the integration between stormwater and the food production that was happening. Fourth, the viable strategy for data measurement. We launched a monitoring program along this that assessed what the stormwater management volume actually was in real time. That monitoring continues to this day and demonstrates really strong performance. And we were monitoring the amount of agricultural product that was being produced and then sold by residents at the farmers market. And finally, the right set of partners to carry the work forward. So we had these kind of formal partners, all with the exception of the city, paid partners to drive this program forward. And then I just want to mention, in terms of scaling, we have had some opportunities now to think about first scaling within Peoria, as they've now gotten their consent decree signed and launched a stormwater utility that's providing funding for the implementation of that. And then we're also looking at scalability of this kind of concept in other places, particularly the idea of taking a multi-benefit planning approach and fundraising approach to the implementation of green stormwater infrastructure. And we are now setting up a program to be able to support multiple cities who want to do a similar kind of planning process to help them line up funding proposals for federal funds. And then in Philadelphia, we're working on something similar, but the focus there is on unlocking healthcare, the healthcare industry as a payer source for green stormwater infrastructure. I think I'm over time, so I will stop there.
April, you make the job so easy by just spelling out all of those areas where Greenprint nailed it in terms of having proven practice implementation, doing the co-creation with the core constituents, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't have much left to recap except to shift gears to Chris, and then I think the panel is going to be quite a lot of fun to unpack some of these lessons across. Thanks, April. Chris, you want to take it away?
Sure, thanks. My name is Chris Wilson. I am the director of the Audubon Conservation Ranching Program. We work in 15 states, mostly in the middle part of the country, westward to California, on ranches that currently encompass something like 3.5 million acres. So this Audubon Conservation Ranching Program is all about addressing a problem through a new approach, a market-based approach. And if you flip to the next slide, I'll address how and why we sort of moved in this direction. So ultimately, the problem is grassland bird population declines. Grassland birds have declined more than any other suite of bird species across their range. 53% declines in the last 50 years. That's more than any other suite of bird species. So it's a serious problem. Previous approaches, setting aside land, cost share approaches to help pay for practices, various other ways of going about achieving conservation in grasslands has just simply not worked, and the declines continue. And so Audubon, of course, comes at this from the standpoint of a bird conservation organization. And when we looked at this, we recognized that grassland birds really were facing a crisis and we needed to do something about it. And so we began piloting this approach on, a dozen ranches across 5 states about a decade ago, testing some of the practices and some early protocols for what would become our certification program. Prior to applying and getting the SIG grant, which was a 3-year grant that allowed us to really take the program up to the scale we needed to be able to take it. That's actually what allowed some of the early funding for my position and some of our other work across the states. So yeah, flip to the next slide if you would. I should say, as you're doing that, grassland, we recognize that grassland conservation really is very much inextricably linked to our food system. And, the people that are managing grasslands are farmers and ranchers. And if we were going to have any impact on those lands and on the habitat on those lands, we really needed to figure out a way to work directly with farmers and ranchers. So it is a market-based approach in that it connects bird-friendly practices to consumer demand for healthy food and sustainability. And it's a market-driven approach in the fact that it creates in the marketplace, really for the first time, a way for consumers to recognize conservation attributes in a product of beef or bison on a store shelf. So the certification tells the consumer that Audubon has done the work to ensure that those lands are being managed according to our protocols in ways that are good for bird habitat and ecosystems generally. So the more demand we can create ultimately is what drives the markets, which ultimately drives the need, the supply, which ultimately translates to more acres of bird habitat. Next slide. So I wanted to just spend some time sort of focusing kind of in the context of the ARCH framework, some of the key lessons that we learned. I think the first would be to involve key players early in the process. So we did this, we actually met with farmers and ranchers in various states, asking them about the types of practices that we could implement, the protocols that we could implement that would balance conservation on the ground to their needs from a standpoint of a rancher, and what was realistic and what could be accomplished. We brought in an early Whole Foods, one of the early guys from Whole Foods, early days, Michael Besanson, to give us some consultant work on marketing and markets and thinking about how we develop markets and what that could look like. Because trust me, Audubon is not suited to developing beef supply chains. And we learned about that as we moved through the process. I would say key here is kind of our assumptions. You go into a project with a set of assumptions. And I think one of the early things we assumed is that we were going to find a way to get packages of beef sort of out there in these grocery store chains on the shelves where consumers could go, and there'd be a package of beef with the Audubon seal, maybe next to a package of beef that was just sort of conventional. And we could just have success in doing that. We learned pretty quickly. These are complex markets. Food systems, supply chains to large grocery store chains. It's not the kind of thing where you go meet with a manager and he or she just decides you can start sourcing a product there. So we learned a lot about beef markets. The key thing I would say we learned is that Audubon, is not adept at creating, connecting beef markets or beef supply chains. So we really relied on more and more, we relied on market partners and experts who know beef markets to develop some of these things. We more or less facilitated the creation of 2 new brands of beef solely around our program, one of which is a national sort of delivered to your door subscription beef program called Blue Nest Beef. Another locally here in Missouri called prairie bird pastures, both of which developed around our program. So when we work with a brand now, essentially we work with the brand to source all of their animals from Audubon certified ranches, which can also translate to mean switching, getting all of their current suppliers Audubon certified, and then really just supporting them through our marketing efforts and driving our members and others to those market partners so that ultimately they can sell more beef, because ultimately that is what makes us successful. I think another one was this concept of testing, learning, iterating. We absolutely did that. I think, like I said, we quickly switched our market. If you see the market ecosystem diagram I have here, you know, we originally thought everything would sort of be retail markets on the left, but we quickly learned that our biggest opportunity lies in national, online, ship to your door markets at the top. Institutional markets are currently a huge part of what is driving animals in our program. So that is selling to hospitals and universities through a couple of our brand partners. A lot of opportunity there. We had no idea that was even out there. And, you know, a lot of our ranchers sell direct, but that's very local. We'd like to help them become more successful, but really a lot of potential ways to connect to markets outside of what we just assumed would be, let's get into Whole Foods kind of a thing. So let's see, I would just say another thing we needed to understand was who the payer is. You know, at the beginning, of course, the payer was Conservation Innovation Grants Program, USDA, and some other philanthropic foundations and things that have funded our program. Ultimately, though, the ultimate payer is the consumer. I mean, the only way this works is getting a certain segment of the consumer to decide they actually want to buy what is a premium product that costs more than just your $3.99 pound of ground beef on the shelf at your local grocery store. They're paying a few dollars more for a package of beef, knowing that it's doing good things for birds, good things for the land, good things for the environment. So that ultimately, that consumer is the one that becomes the payer. I would just say that ultimately, I feel like this concept has a lot of potential to expand into other ecosystem services. You know, consumers are becoming more and more aware. They're more and more concerned about the impacts of their food on the environment generally. And obviously consumers, a segment of consumers are becoming more aware of climate impacts, water scarcity, biodiversity generally. I think all of these things have the potential to be commoditized, if you will, in the marketplace, where the consumer would recognize those attributes and pay more for those products. So that's ultimately what we're doing. Last slide, if you will. So yeah, moving forward, what we're doing a lot of now, we've brought on a marketing manager, a communications manager, and our goal now is really to start to tell this story, to get the message out, engage the media more than we've ever done before. We're actually stepping it up. We just did a partnership with a company of beef called Panorama Organic Grass-Fed that's going to be in something like 1,000 stores across the country. So within a few months, you'll see our green seal on products of beef and a whole lot of Whole Foods and other stores in about 2/3 of the country. So I feel like we're stepping it up to a whole new scale from where we began, you know, 4 years ago. And SIG was instrumental to that. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Chris. And as we're getting the panelists queued up for some discussion here and ditching the slides for now, I do hope everybody's next meat meal would come, if you are a meat eater, would come from one of those providers. Anyways, one thing as we switch into the panel discussion, would love to return back to our earlier question that we put in the chat box. And just ask for those of you who were brave enough to put a flaw in a project model into the chat. Does the flaw you identified earlier have a home on the arch? And so if you want to pile into the chat some aspects of whether you saw that flaw or limitation reflected in the arch, the arch is kind of a living and breathing hypothesis for those elements of best practice in project design, but in no way did we ever set out and say that it was comprehensive. So helpful to see what you're up against, and also if this is indeed a good tool. So let's see here. One thing I wanted to just kick us off with, Sean, April, Chris, I think across the board, one of the best practice bricks, test, learn, iterate, improve. Though it's a best practice brick, I think in some ways it's kind of the mortar that sticks a lot of it together. And so I would just ask for how you've imagined pitching a project that you know is going to pivot or need to navigate uncertainty in some way, and how people can think about needing to impress their funders that they have all the answers, with the practicality that they're definitely without all those answers and are going to have to keep their knees bent.
So I can hop in on that. I would say with this project, with the Well Farm project in particular, the iteration on it was largely sub big concept level. We needed to have the big concept essentially locked in order to get the funding, and then we needed to adhere to that big concept. But there was then a lot of space for iteration underneath that big concept, and we did that through this constant engagement with the stakeholder working and advisory group, where we were making incremental new decisions to collectively every couple of months. There's another innovation model that we're working on right now, one that I'd mentioned in Philadelphia, where we've got funding from the William Penn Foundation to do some work to try to unlock the healthcare community as a payer source for green stormwater infrastructure. And the intent of that is that it's going to help elevate and amplify the vegetative components of green infrastructure, which has been a challenge for the city of Philadelphia to get their green stormwater infrastructure program to truly be vegetative, which is where all of the community co-benefits really come from. The development of that concept with a partner like the William Penn Foundation has been very iterative. They initially funded us to just build a basic case, look at what the literature says, start to engage a few healthcare stakeholders, health insurance companies, get a sense from them of, is this something that would be of interest to them? We confirmed that and then said, okay, we think we're ready for the next stage. Now we think we need to bring together a collaborative of health stakeholders and the water department and the health department and the sustainability department and a number of other folks that would be part of implementing this. And we need to co-create this design with them. So again, the William Penn Foundation said, we think this is a really interesting idea. We want to fund the next stage of it. So now we're in the process of this collaborative stakeholder convening to develop that concept, which is a 6 to 8 month intensive process that we're going through with all of those stakeholders. Once we get to then a clear agenda, which will be like an applied research agenda for delivering health first green stormwater infrastructure in a coherent neighborhood in Philadelphia, to see whether or not that intervention drives health outcomes and creates savings for the health insurance plans and providers, then we will go out and seek another round of funding for that. So in that case, we've been intentional that this needed to be iterative and incremental, and we're going to align the funding stages with that, and we're going to work with a funder who is willing to and interested in being a part of that kind of collaborative and incremental approach.
You're effectively working with the supply and the demand side of the dynamics for that project approach, from how I interpret that, co-creating across and positioning Greenprint as really I'm going to use a jargony word, but the intermediary in the middle who can really structure the project and program.
Yep, absolutely. With green infrastructure being the supply and the demand being the health outcomes and the health payers. Yeah.
Chris, Sean, care to wage into the iterate test, promise your funders the sky and figure out what that means on the way there?
Yeah, I would just reiterate the fact that it shouldn't be a project proposal to sort of include this assessment, sort of pilot concept, because that was a big part of what we use the term pilot in our project a lot. We talk about pilot states and the various approaches we're using, both in the development of our capacity for how we're working with ranches on the land is different among our various states. We're seeing what works best. Do we hire staff that work directly? Do we contract out certain things? Can we work with partner organizations on other things? And even the marketing and the market development approach, there's not a one size fits all. So we've tried a lot of things, super local, trying to develop local markets and see if we could replicate those out, all the way to this big new approach, which is partnering with a very large national brand and seeing if that's how we scale this thing up. So I think in your proposal, you shouldn't feel the need to present a case where you already know how all this is going to work.
Yeah,
Tom, I know you have a comment.
No, I actually don't. I think what April and Chris nailed is important. And all I can say briefly is that, we did unfortunately encounter some projects that were so married to their original vision that they were unwilling to pivot. And more importantly, face the absolutely certain information they were staring at, that their original hypothesis was not going to work. And so the pivot and iterate thing is really important.
Well, and I do think April and Chris, both of you commented specifically to aspects of your approach that had really helped to unlock some scale or continuation of the model and expansion there. But just generally, maybe I'll ask you to state if you had to boil down or categorize what had helped that project approach get beyond the veritable pilot, right? What really led to the follow-on success characteristically? If you had to dial it down to one thing.
Chris, you're on mute.
I'll start. Sorry. Yeah, for us, I think undoubtedly, we spun around with supply chains and market development. Nothing was working. Probably 2 years, we hit a wall. What are we going to do? And ultimately, we really stepped it up at that point and really engaged market partners, brands, and fully engaged them and helped fund them even to help do some things as part of our program. And that really is where we're moving towards now, because they know how to do all this stuff. This is their business. It's not our business. So now we're very much in the process of facilitating experts and partners who know that part of the business. And that has really taken us to where we are now, which I feel is at the cusp of really scaling this to something pretty large.
And Sean, we've spent much time over the years talking about the veritable valley of death that is encountered by many a pilot project and the attempt to scale, replicate, achieve that next phase of development using the market development framework, if you will. And I wonder if you think back across generally projects that succeeded and are kind of developing national level approaches, those that did not, any additional insight from the Arch or otherwise that you gleaned from this research or even other project work and clients?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in the report, we're quite clear that the Arch framework applicability really is an early stage to nascent pilot stage. This is not, you've got a $200 million project and you're looking for $1 billion in financing. But with that said, what I have seen subsequent to actually working on the framework with you, Leigh, is that for those folks that have actually had a successful demonstration pilot or number of pilots and they're now looking to scale, the three things that keep coming up, which have relevance when they look at scaling capital, are the three essential elements, because the impact investor wants to know that there's a problem being solved, that the proponent has identified the payer, and that the team is worthy of being backed. And so I would say, if you extract those three Arch elements for the scaling, assuming that the proponent can demonstrate how the other voussoirs and best practice bricks were addressed, if they can nail those three elements, their chances, in my opinion, and in my exposure in working in our space, their chances greatly enhanced to be able to support the rationale that they are investable, fundable.
Well, and I think there's something else here that we want to elevate for the audience, and that has to do with funding versus financing, perhaps. So notwithstanding that part of the idea that we all had going into the Conservation Innovation Grant cohort was going to be that there was a real clear role for financing. Sean, thank you for the cute cameo there. I think that was restorative for many of us.
Right on cue, right on cue.
So I think, April, to pick on your model, I think you found something that worked as an operating company. And Chris, I think you found something that was well supported by the cash flows from the partnership and didn't really have a strict need for financing. So I wonder if each of you could wax philosophic for just a minute about kind of what that learning entailed and at what point you've proven the revenue to the area, you've got the cash flows that could potentially need or support a role for financing.
Sure, I can hop in on this, and it gets back to a little bit of the question around scaling. I think what is most scalable about what we did is the team's expertise and the process, the best practices of how to apply these concepts in process. And our scaling has so far not been expanded scaling in Peoria. It has been applying those similar concepts and processes to the problem of combined sewer overflow and the solution of green stormwater infrastructure in a variety of other places with an innovative approach, a multidisciplinary, multi-benefit, multiple funding opportunities kind of approach to how you go about addressing that problem. And so the thing that would enable scale there is the fact that there's 770 cities across the United States that have a combined sewer overflow challenge. The funding mechanism for that ultimately is that those utilities need to pay for a solution. And so there's a forcing mechanism to provide that revenue stream. But there's been a massive need for financing. First, there's a massive need for those cities and utilities to actually commit to and raise those sources of funding, because affordability challenges with ratepayers are significant. And so most cities don't have the amount of revenue committed at this point that would be needed to solve the solution at the scale solve the problem at the scale of it. And those that are committing to it want to be able to experiment with green stormwater infrastructure and these multi-benefit solutions, but not take on all of the financial risk. And so that's generated a need for us to get really good at the financing side. So there's a gap being bridged between the utility saying, okay, we're going to pay for delivered gallons managed or delivered impervious acres managed at the end of the day, but you, partner, you need to take on the risk that you're going to be able to deliver those, and you need to take on that financial risk as well. And so that's put us into conversation and partnership with a number of financing partners so that we can bring that gap bridger to the table.
Which gets us into the territory of dialing risk with reward, right? So the more risk that you're asking, especially your capital provider, to put into the model or take on, the more reward, the more upside that they will expect as part of that. We have a hand raised from co-founder Peter Stein. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I have a question, both one for April and one for Chris. And I'll start with Chris. I think it's fascinating that, the distribution mechanism for bird-friendly, habitat-friendly beef is beginning to happen at scale. Has that generated either actual or at least an attempt to recruit purchasers as supporters, donors, members to Audubon? Yes, they're paying hopefully a premium that falls into the pockets of the ranchers that are doing these good habitat management practices. But is there another element to this that Audubon might be exploring?
Yeah, I would say it gets a little bit complicated with the market partners and the success of these brands that are carrying our seal. Thus far, we have kind of kept this firewall between revenues via the market and Audubon's funding to make this program work. So what I'm saying there is we've not asked anybody, any market partner, any rancher, any retailer to give us a cut in some way to support the program, just because we want to avoid that perception that Audubon is somehow in this to profit or make money. That remains a challenge that we will continue to assess how we can somehow achieve continued support for our program, but also expand these markets where we need to. The thing about growing Audubon membership and interest in our work is really compelling. It's something we thought about from the beginning. As we expanded into some of these urban markets, some of the consumers that maybe are younger, maybe have never heard of Audubon, which, by the way, I typically find if you're like under 40, you're like, Audubon? Is that like that German highway kind of a thing? But if you're a little old lady bird watcher, well, yeah, right away who Audubon is. So anyway, as we are in these marketplaces and people are exposed to Audubon, National Audubon Society, oh, what's that all about? Yes, I think that there's the potential for us to gain supporters. And I'll just say that there's no question that as we have moved into this scale, we're getting a whole lot more attention from a lot of interested parties. And some of those are funders. They're interested in funding our program because they like what we're doing. So it does make a difference when you get to scale.
Well, now, April, and full disclosure, I am one of the world's biggest fans of Greenprint partners, but April knows that. But as evidenced in the video, we can all get kind of, into the weeds, so to speak, around green infrastructure. But let's talk about the co-benefits, the community benefits of delivering nature in communities that have nature deficits. And could you just speak to that a little bit? Because I think that's what we're also being somewhat apprised of what you're doing with William Penn. I think that's where the health connection will come out strongest. Can you just talk about how Greenprint is thinking about those layers as well?
Yeah, and good to see you, Peter, as always. So the green space benefits linked to health outcomes is a really fundamental area of co-benefit for green stormwater infrastructure. There's a whole host of additional co-benefits that people often don't think about, like economic development. So you can put in green stormwater infrastructure in an economic corridor around a shopping facility, and it improves shoppers' willingness to pay, for example. So there's, some surprising benefits. There's crime reduction benefits that come along with GSI as well. In terms of physical health and mental health benefits of green stormwater infrastructure. The data is particularly strong around large green space development and greening of vacant lots, turning into reduced anxiety and depression, increased sense of safety and belonging in a community, willingness to go out and be part of one's community, reduced violence, reduced burglaries. There's a whole host of things that come along with bringing more well-designed natural spaces into urban communities. There's stress reduction that comes along with having visibility to just being able to see out your window a beautiful rain garden, and certainly time spent under tree canopy, going out and taking a walk because the heat has been reduced. You're feeling a little cooler. There's more shade available. That prompts people to be more physically active, et cetera. So those are all benefits that are really well documented for a number of green typologies. And this work in Philadelphia is going to give us an opportunity to get even a little bit more granular about the specifics of green stormwater infrastructure design, which is oftentimes more incremental green space development than, say, a large park development. And that's an area where there's more research yet to be done.
Great. If I could just take one more minute of April's time. Full disclosure, the consulting part of Lime Timber does work with the William Penn Foundation, but I was precluded from working on one specific mechanism that I helped them develop. In this case, the mechanism was used with Greenprint partners, and I have a conflict there, but it's called a recoverable grant. And April, could you just describe that briefly? Because there are a handful of funders that are participating with us. There are a number of NGOs and potential grantees that might find a way to use that mechanism. I like to describe it as exactly halfway between a PRI and a grant, but why don't you take a shot at it?
Yeah, so simply, William Penn Foundation provided us a grant with the expectation that if any portion of that grant activity led to the Philadelphia Water Department paying for the projects that we developed under it, that those funds would get paid back. So it's actually purely grant funds, but it has an attachment to it that says that if we use this money to develop a set of green stormwater infrastructure projects, and we were able to successfully take those to funding decisions by the Philadelphia Water Department, that we would pay those back to the foundation. And the reason that was a philanthropic effort is because we were taking a mission-driven approach to the development of projects that we were doing. We were looking specifically for mission-driven landowners in high-poverty neighborhoods. And all of that work to get to an application for funding was at risk to be able to get there. But the foundation wanted to see more projects in those types of neighborhoods, and they wanted to see more highly vegetative projects being incentivized.
Well, I could keep going with this all day long. However, we did only schedule 75 minutes and we're coming up to that mark. I want to just do a quick, maybe round robin among the panel here. And it's kind of the magic wand question. If there was one thing that you could wave your magic wand and solve for in the market universe, in the conservation finance funding realm, what have you, what would that one element be that would really unlock the type of work that you want to see advanced, and why? And I'll take a brave first respondent before circling around.
For us, the magic wand would be a secured revenue source for all utilities across the country, that infrastructure would not be so severely underfunded. That's the thing that is fundamentally constraining scale.
I'll jump in and just say appropriate credit enhancement is really what's needed to offer the appropriate de-risking to the impact investment community that keeps coming up over and over. And with that, I have to jump. So I want to say thank you. And thanks, Chris and April. Fantastic.
Thanks, Sean. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, mine's a combination of market development and marketing. It's really tough to take on the machine, if you will. I mean, industrial ag and the beef vertically integrated beef system to grocery stores is so hard to crack. You have to reinvent supply chains. So that is the central challenge. But I think the more we can connect to people in alternative ways and tell them about alternative ways, once they become aware, and you've got places, that is markets, to direct them to, which, by the way, I just put a link in the chat to direct you guys to a market to buy Audubon certified beef, then I think you can make this happen pretty quickly. So that's the challenge, though.
I think from my end, this came up a couple times this week, but the pre-development dollars, where do you actually get the walking around money, the upfront money to catalyze the project, to pay for the salaries and the staff time and the partnership and the pre-development work for a model to go or to expand? So more catalytic dollars. That does bring the week to a close. Before we adjourn here, one thing just to call some attention to, we have in the chat box a link to a form for you to share your takeaways, your ahas from the content this week, as well as just a couple thoughts you might have for your own journey on something you want to read, someone you want to talk to and follow up with, those intentions for where your journey is going to continue now that we're coming to the end of the bootcamp virtual workshop sessions. So looking forward to your responses. They're really meant for you to articulate that commitment for continued action and learning. So too, we've dropped into the chat the link to register for the CFN e-news, which is our primary way of sharing original research and insight from practitioners in the field, as well as a roundup of innovation and goings-ons. We have a job board that is like seriously fun to check out and see how the field is growing and evolving based on who's hiring what, as well as events, webinars, other things that are kind of happening in the field. So it's meant to be a real central hub for anyone who wants to continue engaging in the space and perhaps carry on in their journey, connecting, networking, etc. I would be incredibly remiss to not spend a moment thanking Peter and Brad, co-founders of the bootcamp. This being the 15th year of, granted virtual, but still a bootcamp. I think it's just incredibly important, impactful, and humbling, the level of dedication that you both have shown in growing and supporting this community of practice and really helping any of us carry along in our journey alongside you. So thank you for just the tremendous investment in us in this field as we've gone. Also, our colleagues and partners at Highstead and the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and especially my colleagues at CFN, Helen Rogers and Jackson Moeller, and our fearless intern, Hallie. Without each of your efforts, this was not possible. And last but certainly not least, all of the attendees, the 64 of you remaining in this session, but also everyone who's joined us for the week. It's a poor stand-in for in-person connection and networking, but we're so thrilled to have this opportunity and just invite you to stay connected, to keep in touch, to become a part of this diffuse reciprocity community of people who really want to solve problems with innovation in the money side, the funding and financing side. We know there's a huge shortfall and we can talk about that, but it's a little bit more fun to talk to creative and thoughtful humans on how we're collectively going to structure and scale and launch all of the project work, innovations, and programs that are going to actually combat those challenges. So with that, we'll ring off and let you to your regularly scheduled Thursdays, or if you're joining us from Australia, perhaps Friday mornings. But really just on behalf of all of us at the Conservation Finance Network and everyone who's been a part of bootcamp 15 years strong, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this journey. And we really look forward to carrying it on together. So with that, we'll stop the recording and let you all on. Thank you again.